Hello everyone and welcome back to Deckled Edges. I'm your host Camilla and today we're going to be talking about The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. I almost said by Robert Langdon, but that's the main character, so a little bit of a difference there. So I would like to preface this by saying I've read a book by Dan Brown before. I had read a couple years ago Inferno, which is technically a later book in the same series that stars Robert Langdon. Now, for some context, Robert Langdon is a Harvard professor, a symbologist. He deals with symbols and he's very knowledgeable about the history tied to symbols. And he also has this talent for codes and just quick thinking. So that makes him a pretty compelling main character. And he's put in these situations that have to do with history, art history, that kind of thing, and cryptology. So that's where he kind of gets his momentum from, this academic background that just happens to be perfectly suited to every situation that he's put in. But nevertheless, I think that it's just important context to have as to who his character is. And we'll talk a little bit more later about some qualms I have with that. But really my main point is that I really do remember enjoying Inferno, but I think it was also circumstantial. I wasn't reading it very critically. I wasn't reading it with a lens of high expectation because at the time, it wasn't a book I necessarily picked up at random from the library. It was a book that happened to be in some small little library in an Airbnb that I was staying at over the summer one time. And, it was quarantine, so I would literally read anything. And when I say anything, I mean that I genuinely read 18 books in a singular month over COVID, and it just escalated from there. It was book after book. So there was a large repertoire of questionable books that I read during that period of time. But I do distinctly remember Inferno pleasantly surprising me, and I was able to finish it in a weekend, a day and a half maybe. And it's not a small book either. So I think that kind of gave me a good impression of Dan Brown, and even though I had already known about a lot of the hype around the Da Vinci Code, or controversy as well, I hadn't really known too much about that. So I kind of went into this book blind, but the only thing I knew were that I had some high expectations, considering that I had read a book by him before, and I liked it decently well from what I remember. But I literally was walking around with this book when I was 2 chapters in a line at an airport, and I was stopped by 2 people, 2 grown men, to say that they liked this book a lot and they really liked the movie too. And I'm like, I didn't even know it had a movie. So the expectations were pretty high going into it, and I do have a lot to say. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's go. So one of the main things about this book that I really stood out to me was that there's a big blending of like fact and fiction here, which isn't super clear to the reader and is kind of portrayed from the beginning as it's meant to be a little bit confusing, and it really does achieve that. And I think I was doing some research for this episode, and I found out that this was like a main source of controversy around this book. A lot of people take this book to be, anti-Christian or like proposing very controversial takes about aspects of Christianity and their portrayal of certain parts of Christianity. Now, I think that this is an important thing to consider when reading this book, what bias the author might have or what they're really trying to get you to think or feel. But I also think that in many of the criticisms that I read, it almost felt like they were confusing this fictional novel for a historical fictional novel. And to clarify this for you listeners, a historical fictional novel, by somewhat hazy definition, but is generally considered to be a novel that takes historical elements and is essentially a retelling of history, but takes imaginative liberties to create a plot, with characters and, fill in the gaps with history, but not alter the history itself. Now, the Da Vinci Code, I think, crosses that line a little bit and doesn't necessarily meet the qualifications for historical fiction. What this book does is take a bunch of semi-historical theories, conspiracy theories, symbols, like parts of bits and pieces of different things from different sources that somewhat tie into each other and, have very questionable credibility, and put them together into a sort of puzzle to make a more linear, seemingly like canonical storyline, which I don't think there's anything wrong with because the book is fiction, but because so many people interpreted it, and I think it's presenting itself a little bit deceptively, I think, at first, because it starts off like fact. There's a page that's like fact. The Priory of Sion was fact. The Priory of Sion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. Fact. The 1975 Paris Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as les dossiers secrets, identifying numerous members of the Priory of Sion. I've looked into this, and the main qualm people have is that these facts are presented right off the bat, and then it turns out these documents that they discovered are fraudulent, and, the Priory of Sion is only loosely tied to, these concepts of Mary Magdalene and what they try to express in this novel. But I guess my main point is that I think that Dan Brown doesn't make it clear he oscillates between fact and fiction, and kind of meshes it together in a way that is great for a novelist, but makes for kind of a confusing read, because next to some very factual thing about the Fibonacci sequence, he just immediately goes into a somewhat convoluted and, like I said, pieced together historical explanation that is read off as like fact to the reader. So I think that is mainly what a lot of the discourse around this book stems from. But when you're reading it from a fictional standpoint, a lot of it starts to make a little bit more sense, because you're not really ensnarled in all of these kind of convoluted claims that the author makes. And truly, going into this book blind, it starts off interestingly. You have this encounter, you have this man with a secret, and who is immediately intriguing, who is immediately in an intriguing position. It's a hook, and he's getting murdered, and he has to figure out what to do about it. He has this secret that he must pass on. Cue the entry of Robert Langdon, that's the stem of his involvement. And then you're thrown a curveball with Sophie Neveu, how she becomes involved. And, this entry sequence, the first couple chapters, are truly an interesting hook. And you also have to remember the context too. I feel like there are countless pieces of media that start off with a death. But there's something unique about this one in that it sets up the entire chain of events for the rest of the novel in the form of a code that is continually relevant. And I just think that's very nice, because it's almost like this puzzle that the reader is trying to solve alongside that's why it's so successful, I believe, because it's interactive in a sense. Like, everything that is reveals another layer of the brilliance of this man that we were introduced to for 5 pages in the beginning of this novel. We learn more and more about him, and his cleverness shines through. And there's nothing I like more than a clever character. I really like clever characters, even if, they die in the first chapter. But this also brings me to another point that I kind of wanted to talk about, and I know it's going to sound like it's a lot of criticism of this book, but there were just certain things that I want to highlight because I feel like they're fairly unique. It's not a jab at the book itself, but I think it could have been done better. I think that Robert Langdon's character is interesting. Obviously he's a professor at a well-known institution. He's loved, he's likable. So he's charismatic, but he's also very knowledgeable about symbols and conveniently, gets into this kind of thing because he has this reputation. But he almost, especially in this book, feels too overpowered. And it's clear to the reader that he's just a guy, but at the same time, he is in a position, it almost feels like he's supposed to be thrown into the thick of an incredibly uncomfortable, gritty situation, which is true, he is. It's not a normal situation by any means. and he's at the heart of, like, he's being chased by Interpol, but at the same time, it almost feels throughout this whole book that somehow he's in his element, you know, especially when balanced out by Sophie Naveau. They just feel like they're in their element all the time. They're so confident. They're doing, like, even when he hesitates, he's confident, you know, and they're faced with a cryptic message, multiple cryptic messages, puzzle after puzzle, and you're telling me there's a cryptographer and a symbologist that have to figure it out? A symbologist who just happened to write a manuscript on this literal subject? Yes, it makes sense for the context. It's explained well in the book, but it doesn't seem like they're really being pushed, which is almost something that I wish I saw a little more of, because every so often, like, obviously I know they have to figure out the puzzles and you really want them to, but it always seems like they're resolved by some sort of eureka moment. There's like 5 times in this book where Robert Langdon or Sophie or even Sir Teabing, they figure out a puzzle with a snap of the finger, like, eureka, I got it. It just came to me. I wish they had to work a little harder for the answers, you know, because as much fun as it is to read about people pondering a puzzle, they have all this background knowledge on the subject and the reader doesn't. So it doesn't even feel like we can figure it out with them. They're not going through these, like, you know, hoops to, you know, sometimes they are, but for the most part, there's a lot of puzzles that just aren't as fun for the reader because it comes to the character in a snap of a finger. 1 second they know, they don't know, and 1 second they do. So it doesn't feel as compelling. But anyway, so in the start of this book, we have Robert Langdon being called in because he was, you know, we find out soon enough that Jacques Saunière, the guy who was murdered by Silas, as we know, don't you love that dramatic irony? He left a message, and the police, specifically this one man, Bezu Fash, we found out later, somehow, you know, he's kind of connected to Aringo Rosa, the guy who, but the, you know, it's a little bit convoluted, but it overall makes sense, so I'll leave it at that. Especially if you've read the book, you kind of understand it a little more. But he's this really, like, brusque guy, you know. He's known for his hit hard methods, hit him where it hurts, get to the bottom of every situation with these, like, really direct methods. So essentially we find out that he's trapping Langdon because he thinks that Robert Langdon committed this murder. Because Jacques Saunière wrote, P.S. Find Robert Langdon. Great. You were a mastermind. You were brilliant. You wrote all of this convoluted, crazy puzzle in like 20 minutes while you died a slow death. This isn't me being insensitive, too. I really, like, it's kind of shocking to read. But at the same time, it almost feels like you don't see how that could be, like, you can add an addendum and be like, he's not the murderer, BT dubs. You know, puts him kind of in a tough position there. But anyway, so to Fash, to the police, they're in the Louvre, by the way. So that's important later on at the very end of the novel, which I also had qualms about because I thought it felt rushed and a little strange. But you know what? We'll get there. But so the French police think that Langdon did it. And then all of a sudden, we're introduced to Sophie Naveau. She is Saunière's granddaughter. Crazy, right? And she realizes that one of the things that her grandfather left in this message that named Langdon was that P.S. stood for Princess Sophie and that she should find him and needed to help him somehow. This whole family lore is so complex that you just need to read the book. It's just, there's so much going on. But it is a compelling, you know, she's estranged. She's his estranged granddaughter. And it almost feels like a little bit annoying when you kind of figure out more of how this family development happens. The whole thing with Sophie's family, I believe, is a little bit retconned. I mean this to say, her involvement with her grandfather, the reason they were estranged, I won't necessarily spoil it, but I also feel as if the gravity of what she witnessed was built up. And it did hit hard. It was a shocking thing to witness. But it was also kind of explained away in a second. So it almost feels as if her stubbornness and unwillingness to hear as a part of her character, was kind of wiped away by Langdon explaining it to her in a sentence and almost invalidating that feeling just because, it was like, it's just a tradition, that like a pagan ritual, like it's okay, it was just, I know it's shocking, but it's okay. And then Sophie's just like, I feel so bad, I should have just talked to my granddad. And yeah, maybe you should have, but it's a difficult line. But let me talk about something positive that I liked about this book. Now, I know I talked a lot about how I didn't like that a lot of the answers just came to the characters. I understand that that's how it works in real life. When you're knowledgeable about something, you just have to think about it for a while, and sometimes you'll get this epiphany. But what I did like was that a lot of the times you do see their thought processes, and you see how, although I think a little bit overpowered, and I did say that they were in their element a little too much, even though they are, the way that their characters' strengths work together makes for a really interesting kind of picking their brains moment, because you get to see how the different strengths, academic strengths, different like thought strengths, different amounts of information that they know just bounce off each other, work with each other perfectly to really, drive the story forward. And they all have connections. They have different ways of working through puzzles. They, especially even in like more physical scenes where they actually have to get, throw hands, it is very almost rhythmic the way that they work together, or the way you see a different side of Langdon or Sophie. They're resourceful people as characters, and it is just an entertaining read overall. I mean, part of why you enjoyed this book is because when you regard it as a fictional novel, a lot of the points are kind of fun. I think that specifically one that stands out to me is when they're escaping the Swiss bank, right? And then the owner of the bank, because he's friends with Jacques Saunier, he, agrees to smuggle them out, takes them in this armored van, and it's a big driver for a lot of the plot, this kind of strange... I didn't know about Swiss vaults before this, so I think that was a very interesting component. But beyond that, I just really liked when he basically messed with the head of the guy from the French police, because he pretended to be this truck driver. It was just such a great piece of characterization for this character that we see for maybe... He doesn't have that much of an impact on the novel, but in this moment, he is so funny. He has this Rolex on, and he just plays it off perfectly. And it just seems like he would just be such a cool guy to do improv with, but then you realize that he's actually really loyal to Sophie's grandfather and then tries to kill them. So, But it is kind of cool to see these little characters that another qualm I have, their story arcs just kind of get wrapped up really hastily at the end of the novel, because the climax is with 20 pages to go. It's a little bit, the pacing is a little rushed towards the end, I believe, but still, while we do get to see these characters, I enjoyed them, and I enjoyed the little moments that they have. Like I said, with the banter that Robert and Sophie have, and even Teabing, we get to see these characters and how their strengths play off of each other, and it just makes the pages fly by, It's a good feeling. Another thing that I haven't really talked about is the import of Opus Dei in this novel, and there's a lot to be said about it. Now, what you need to know is that Silas is the quote-unquote monk. They refer to him as a monk, but he's not really a monk. He is a member of Opus Dei, and he's the albino man who killed Jacques Saunier at the beginning of the novel, and we know this. So we go in with a very interesting perspective on this man. We know that he is doing this for what he believes to be a higher purpose, which is protecting the integrity of Opus Dei from the Priory of Sion, who he believes is trying to undermine it. And both him and the leader of Opus Dei, whom he regards as a father figure who took him in, saved him from a life of sin and delinquency, and just bad circumstances, they're both under the orders of this person they call the teacher, who has given them information that is just entirely changed their perspective. It's given them this sense of urgency. And we figure out what it is at the end of the novel. We figure out who the teacher is, and there's a lot that goes into that you just need to read the novel to understand. But at the same time, what struck me is how mixed the feelings of the reader are when you think about Silas and Aringarosa, Father Aringarosa, which is the one he regards as his father figure, who took him in, brought him to Opus Dei, brought him to, God. So what we know is that Silas killed a man who is portrayed to the reader to be not a bad person. And I believe that a lot of the characters in this novel are pretty morally gray, because I don't think that you can completely classify Saunière as a good person. But anyway, so yes, he killed someone because of his convictions and because he was under the orders or the advice of this teacher figure. So I'll use Silas as an example for this, but my point really can be extrapolated to any of the characters. It just goes to show how, despite the qualms I have with this book, I do appreciate how we get this very double-sided view of the characters. They don't feel necessary. They have convictions that don't allow the reader to classify them as good or bad. We see Silas as someone who is relatively misguided and a lot of times in the wrong, but also not really in the wrong, but also yes in the wrong. There's a lot of double-sided backstabbing, different things that go on. So no one's allegiance can really be attributed to one person. In a sense, you could even say that all along he was being manipulated, but these convictions to commit murder came from within himself, his resolve to do it because he thought he was doing it for a higher purpose. So, and then we see him at other points in the novel just killing out of rage, killing senselessly, unnecessarily, and then it becomes removed from that idea that maybe he was being manipulated. So we get a lot of mixed emotions about Silas. And allow me to have a hot take here for a second. Maybe it's lukewarm, depending on who you are. But Silas can also be seen as a parallel into this novel's portrayal of Christianity. I know, right? Mind's blown. The way Silas is portrayed is wishy-washy by Dan Brown. We get depth to him. We get this idea that maybe he's neither good nor bad. Maybe he does more bad than good. But at the end of the day, we do end up feeling bad for him at the end of the novel. We truly, mourn his loss. Not to spoil, but we do mourn his loss a little bit, at least a little bit. Even if you don't sympathize with him at all, we understand where he came from in a sense. But how is it that we feel bad for him, but not necessarily, quote unquote, the teacher, whom arguably had somewhat of a reasoning at least, and this was the only bad thing he ever did, while Silas has a track record? That's another interesting psychological thing to kind of pick apart, because it's just so much of the subtext that goes on within the novel. We see Silas have these moments of humanity. We actually see Silas's perspective, and that in itself kind of programs the reader. Once you see someone's perspective, you're automatically tuned in as the reader to give them importance as a character and resonate with them a little bit, no matter what they do. So in a sense, that's an interesting way that the author uses these literary techniques to be able to further this consideration within our minds. But back to what I was saying, Christianity is also portrayed in a rather interesting way in this novel. Now, a lot of the prior criticisms that I were talking about this novel and the controversy stems from this very controversial take on the history of Christianity that is very present in this novel. However, like I was saying, this novel cannot, in my opinion, be regarded as historical fiction because of the uncredible and already disproven sources that this novel draws upon to build the backbone of its logical historical structure. However, it's also controversial the way that these topics are presented as if they're almost like this blend of fact and fiction, and how it kind of undermines a little bit the core concepts of Christianity with what it's proposing. However, like I was saying, because I think that the only acceptable lens to regard this book under is a fiction novel, it doesn't really bother me because it's meant to be this thought-provoking portrayal that has fictional roots, and on top of that drives a storyline. So in essence, the point I'm trying to make is not that Christianity is necessarily solely portrayed as good or bad in this novel, but the way that Silas is portrayed, the way that we have complex feelings about him, even though we know that he does certain bad things, but we also know his backstory, it is kind of reflective of the characters in this book and the book as a whole, their portrayal of Christianity, and specifically Opus Dei, but overall also its portrayal in the novel, because we don't necessarily get a positive view of it here, but we also don't get a negative one. It's just one that I don't think can be evaluated in the same sense that you would take an actual criticism or an actual praise of Christianity in prose. Because so many of the facts that are presented with this book, the quote-unquote facts, are not actual facts, and it is meant to be a fictional storyline. So I know that this episode has been a lot of talking about the book, but also talking about criticisms of this book and qualms that I had with this book, but I hope it was somewhat entertaining in that regard, because I know that it's kind of difficult to address a book like this and not necessarily talk about why it was so controversial for so long. I don't think that is necessarily founded, because I think that you can have a fictional novel and remove it from criticism that it is attempting to be nonfiction, because you have to regard it as a fictional novel. But I do think that if Dan Brown was walking around parading this book as if it was this genius blending of nonfiction and fiction, I think there would be a little bit of a problem within that, because you can't claim that unfounded facts are nonfiction. It's just not how it works, especially not historical fiction, because there are certain parameters that surround a successful historical fiction novel, and this is not it. But I do think it does work well as a psychological thriller. I think that the big twist at the climax of this book was a little bit predictable, but also still sufficiently shocking to warrant, I guess, the climax of a novel like this. I think that it was built up pretty well. But like I said earlier, it does seem a little bit rushed because everything happens so fast, and it just seems like such a blatant, I wouldn't say mischaracterization, but a little bit of a mischaracterization of a certain pivotal character, because we get context on their relationship before. So it feels very jarring, which I know it's supposed to feel jarring, but it almost feels like an impossibility for it to have worked out exactly the way it did. But nevertheless, we are left relatively speechless, maybe with a couple words in mind. I had words, but I always do. And ultimately, this quest for the Holy Grail, for Langdon at least, was culminated, because not only did he find Sophie, he also found the place to revere, and it was staring at him in the face the whole time. I don't know if you could tell by that awkward silence, but I wasn't all too satisfied with the ending of this book. But there's nothing I can do about it, because realistically, it was the most realistic ending of this book, and regardless of all the little loose ends that just seemed to be retconned, I did appreciate this novel, and I thought that it was interesting, and it really did keep up with the pace, even when the puzzles were solved with a eureka moment. I admit, not my favorite, but I'm not one to rank books. I'm not one to give an entirely negative or positive rating. I think that there was nuance to how one can interpret and enjoy this book. And I think it is definitely a book that you can enjoy. It's interesting, and even when the facts kind of blend in with the fiction, you can get a lot of interesting insight from this book. I think that when you really pick apart at it, Langdon is a smart character, and he's meant to be a smart character. And the smarter the character, the more interesting they are to read because they have more information to offer to the reader. So I think that as long as you don't take every fact as fact and every piece of information as face value, you can get a lot of important insight on how to interpret certain pieces of art, interpret certain pieces of history, how to not believe everything you read in history, not believe how history was written all the time. And I think there's some also just interesting made up concepts and rivalries, and I think that that is really at the core what makes this book run. It's pretty fast paced when there's action scenes, and at times when they're just deliberating, trying to figure things out, it's pretty, mentally stimulating. So overall, there were good things about this book, and there were also things that I kind of had a problem with. And I think there's also things to discuss, which at the heart of soul of any book is really what makes a book a book. You got to be able to talk about it. You got to be able to discuss it. And if it's thought-provoking, all the better. So there you have it, folks. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code on Deckled Edges. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, it is my pleasure to read these books. It is my pleasure to get to make these episodes for you all. It is my pleasure to get to edit them and get to interact with the content in such a fun, interactive, and analytical way. I love being able to share my thoughts with the world, and I love that I have a platform to do so. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again next time. For now, that is all. Bye.